station. Its programs and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. My lovely co-host, Leah Shaper, is supposed to be here, but is having difficulty joining. So hopefully she'll be able to pop in at some point during the presentation, which is going to be quite topical. We're going to be talking about the Dalton minimum cosmic catastrophe. Now, many people don't relate a cold period in the past with a cosmic catastrophe of any kind, but we're going to put the pieces together for you in the next hour, and I believe we're going to open up your eyes to maybe some of the possibilities. And what I mean by cosmic catastrophe is that cooling period back in the early 1800s caused massive crop failure, starvation, famine, and it triggered a large volcanic eruption, and also, which subsequently ended up with the year without a summer in 1816. It also triggered some large earthquakes, including two big ones on the New Madrid in 1811 and 1812. And when I mean triggered, what do I mean? Well, I mean that there is evidence in the last decade that there is a direct connection between solar activity and earthquakes and volcanoes. So let's try to call Leah up here one more time before we share the screen. All right, I'm going to share the screen. Hopefully you can see this because I don't have someone to confirm or deny that the screen is here. So a grand solar minimum or a normal sun, what are we talking about? Well, there has been speculation from many over the last decade that we are entering a grand solar minimum. And some people are saying now it's just a normal sun, that the sun's activity is just lower than normal. So the question then becomes, what is a grand solar minimum? What is it? Well, according to the experts, there is no consensus, but a grand solar minima occurs when several solar cycles exhibit lesser than average activity for decades or centuries. That's it. So grand solar minimums occur when several solar cycles exhibit lesser than average activity for decades or centuries. So it's a composite, it's a guess. Like there was, let's take a look at 400 years of sunspots. Here's the Dalton minimum. So you can see here in the first 20 years of 1800, 2 low solar cycles, 3 actually, the third one here, pretty weak. And together, collectively, the Dalton minimum from 1800 to about 1830 or 35 was a period of low sunspot activity for 3 consecutive cycles. Now, prior to that was the Maunder minimum, which had low solar activity for decades and decades. One of the longest grand minimas in quite some time. We still don't have Leah here. I don't know what's going on there. So, trying to figure that out. While we're doing the live show. So, those listening on the radio, what we have here is a chart of all the recognized grand minima going back to about 950 BC. And that begins the first of the grand minima events, the Homeric minimum, which lasted for quite some time, 150 years. Then there was the Roman warm period, where civilizations flourished, followed by another major minimum here, the Oort minimum in 1000 AD. That only lasted for 40 years, and then we had the medieval maximum and another warming. There's also the Wolf minimum in 1280 to 1350, that one lasting 70 years. The Sporer minimum, 1450 to 1550, a 100-year minimum. The Maunder minimum, 1645 to 1715. That one being 70 years long. The short-lived minimum of just 3 decades, 1790 to 1820, and now we're in the modern maximum and rapidly dropping down into what may be the next grand minimum. Solar cycle 24 and 25 are both two of the weakest cycles in about 100 years or more. 24, in fact, is one of the weakest cycles going back to the Dalton minimum. So based on the definition, if cycle 25 doesn't get any more intense, we are, in fact, and maybe in the middle of a grand solar minimum now, and that would be, we're about 15 years in. So that is the general background on grand minimas. And let's try to call Leah up one more time. I actually could get her up here on the Telegram and see what's going on. So she's having a Skype problem. Okay. Okay, we're waiting for you, Leah. So hopefully she'll be able to get in here somehow. I'm calling her up again there. All right, so let's get on with the Dalton minimum and the focus of this show. So the Dalton minimum is the most recent deep minimum, and there were many effects. It was, in fact, as we just said, a period of low sunspot count representing the low solar activity, which was named after meteorologist John Dalton. They have two time frames here. It lasted from 1790 to 1830 or 1796 to 1820, and corresponds to the solar cycle 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, while the Dalton minimum is often compared with the Maunder minimum, its sunspot number was slightly higher and reported sunspots distributed in both solar hemispheres, unlike the Maunder minimum. So this means that during grand minimums, you can still have solar cycles and you can still have sunspots, which in fact we do have now. So that's what's going on there. The sunspot number was slightly higher and reported sunspots distributed in both solar hemispheres during the Dalton, but not necessarily during the Maunder. The coronal streamers were visually confirmed by Ezra Ames and Joseph Joaquin de Ferre's eclipse drawings in 1806 and indicated similarity of its magnetic field, not with that of the Maunder minimum, but with that of modern solar cycles. So what they're saying is that even during the Dalton minimum, the sun was still quite active, similar to today in the modern minimum that we're now living in. Now, like the Maunder and the Sporer minimum, the Dalton minimum coincided with a period of lower than average global temperature. It's not hemispherical, it's not local like some people claim. All of these grand minimas coincide with a period of lower than average global temperature. So it's not local, it's not a local effect. People like to poo-poo it and say, oh, it was just local, it's just in the northern hemisphere, but that's not true. During the Dalton minimum, there was a variation of temperature of about 1 degree C in Germany alone. Now, here is when the arguments come in. What was the cause of the lower than average temperature? Is it just strictly due to the sun and less sunspots? The cause of the lower than average temperature and their possible relation to the low sunspot count are actually not that well understood. Recent papers suggest that a rise in volcanism is responsible for the cooling trend. And in fact, during these grand minimas, after we deepen into them for at least 10 years, there tends to be a large volcanic eruption, VEI 6 or greater. And in the case of the Dalton minimum, we had the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which was VEI 7. And we'll get to that in great detail in just a moment. So the cause of the lower than average temperature may be related to large volcanic eruptions because they would then block out the sun. And this is true for the year without a summer. And while the year without a summer in 1816 occurred during the Dalton minimum, the prime reason for that year's cool temperatures was the highly explosive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which was one of the largest eruptions in the past 2,000 years. Now, one must also consider that the rise in volcanism may have been triggered by the lower levels of solar output, as there is a weak but statistically significant link between decreased solar output and increased volcanism. Did you hear that? Yeah, explosive volcanic eruptions can be triggered by cosmic rays. Here's the paper. And if you want to see the links and all the visuals, you can rewatch this podcast tonight on Magnetic Reversal News over at our YouTube channel at 8 p.m. Mountain Time. So this paper, do we have a date here? Coming out in June of 2011, is now 12 years old. And it is well known now that volcanoes with silica-rich and highly viscous magma, well, we know they produce violent explosive eruptions like Mount St. Helens. But the idea is that during weak solar cycles, we get bombarded with cosmic rays. These cosmic rays have the ability to heat muons in the subsurface, which heat up these silicious-rich magmas. And then, well, then they go boom, like the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora. So there are peer-reviewed papers in respected journals that have made the connection between low solar activity and explosive volcanic eruptions. So that's kind of interesting. So let's talk about the year without a summer. So we've deepened. First, let's go over it on the chart here. Where is it? So we deepen into the Dalton minimum starting in 1796. We have a whole solar cycle, and then right after that solar minimum into the second solar cycle, we've got a boom. Mount Tambora goes boom in 1815. And it stays cold for quite a while, but for the next year or so, up to 1 degree worldwide. And then the year without a summer. What a bummer. The year, we have a whole podcast dedicated to this, but for those that missed it, this will be a little refresher. Oh, what's going on? Oh, Leah's here. I see Leah. Can you hear us? You're frozen up. Leah is in the house. There you go. Can you hear us? Hello?
I can hear you, but I can't. I can hear you, but I can't see anything. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're now visible.
This is crazy. Wow. Okay, now I can see stuff. So
right.
sorry. Major technical problems here.
Yeah, that took over 20 minutes to deal with.
Yeah, totally insane. Totally, completely insane.
So you probably didn't hear any of the intro or the last 15 minutes?
No, nothing. I heard nothing.
We just discussed what grand solar minimums are, the fact that we're focusing on the Dalton minimum and the two events that happened during the Dalton, the New Madrid earthquake, and the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora. And now we are at the year without a summer, where I'm going to do a cursory review of what happened after Tambora exploded.
Yep.
So you're up to speed.
No, I'm up to speed.
So the year 1816 is known as the year without a summer because of severe climate abnormalities that caused the average global temperature to decrease 0.4 to 0.7 C. That is 1 degree Fahrenheit. Now, again, I want to reiterate here that it caused the average global temperature to decrease. And many of the people that don't want to make the connection between grand minimas and global temperature tend to make the argument that the Dalton and the Maunder minimum were localized events to the Northern Hemisphere.
That chance.
And so what we see in all of the references in all the papers is that it was all of these events were global.
Well,
I can hear me echoing in the background. Do you have a speaker pointed towards your mic?
Nope.
Okay.
Just me.
So evidence suggests that the anomaly was predominantly a volcanic winter, an event caused by the massive 1815 eruption of Tambora in April 15th in the Dust East Indies. The eruption was the largest in the last 1,300 years. And the previous large eruption, which caused a volcanic winter, we've discussed also on the show, which is the worst year to be alive, 536 AD.
Yes.
And And that was actually 2 volcanoes. And scientists still don't know that research has been done, that the worst year on Earth was not, people think it was Krakatoa. Still,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was Lollapalooza and Laki in Iceland. 2 different massive eruptions at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's get that clear. And now here we are, like, you know, almost 1,000 years later, boom, Tambora.
Although, wasn't there something, maybe I'm thinking of a different time frame. Wasn't there something similar around this time frame, that there was a volcano earlier than 1816 that may have contributed? Or am I thinking of another era?
Maybe it was earlier than 536. There were eruptions in 520 something.
I was thinking of 1810, but I may be getting the numbers mixed up in my head.
Well, we know that the year without a summer was Tambora.
Yes.
And also it was an agricultural disaster.
Yeah.
In fact, many people, including historian John T. Post, called this year the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. Mm-hmm. And that is scary, because subsistence crises are not over. We're just in a very good time, and people don't get that. Yes.
Like, it doesn't take a whole lot to completely disrupt systems of agriculture, even when they're not, macroscopic, like the way we tend to do agriculture these days. It doesn't take a lot.
Well, and the supply chain is the issue, not just growing the food. Yeah. So if you were to have an earthquake like the New Madrid one, which we're going to talk about in a minute, what you do is you rupture all of the highways across the country. Nothing is getting through for years.
Right.
Like, what are they all of a sudden like carry stuff across the Mississippi?
Right. I want to point out too that the fact that agriculture became so disrupted really gives the lie to the idea that this was some kind of localized event. You know, even if it was just the Northern Hemisphere, that's still that's a really big deal.
Well, yeah, the reason it happens to coincide with the Northern Hemisphere, and that's why some people think it was local, is because the eruption of Tambora was in the early spring, April 15th. And so we're in summer at that time, when the Southern Hemisphere is in winter, so they're not growing anything. Right. So we just went into the growing season, and for months it was dark and terrible, and it didn't work out. Mm-hmm. The people in the Southern Hemisphere were in winter. So they didn't care about the effects. It's winter.
Right. Right.
So the Northern Hemisphere got screwed. And there is historical accounts all over the Northern Hemisphere. The most documented is starvation in New England, mm-hmm. starvation in Atlantic Canada, mm-hmm. and parts of Western Europe. And the reason that we have those accounts is because that's where most of the people were.
Right. Right. And you have all of these accounts of like snow falling in New York in June and stuff like that. Frost.
Yeah. So the Tambora eruption was massive. It was a VEI 7. It happened during the second cycle in the drop down of the Dalton. And what we did share is this paper, the proof in the pudding. See, there's no definite consensus or link that says that low solar activity makes it cold. But what we do have is the fact that huge eruptions happen right in the middle of these low solar activities, and that makes it even colder. Mm-hmm. So maybe grand solar minimums, the weak sun idea, people think that the sun is weak and that's why it's cold here. The sun is weak and it's bombarding the earth with cosmic rays. Those cosmic rays do bad things. They mutate things on the surface, first of all. Mm-hmm. They also heat silicious-rich magma, which causes violent volcanoes to erupt. Mm-hmm. And they may also trigger earthquakes.
Well, and it's not just that the sun is throwing lots of cosmic rays at us. The lack of solar activity makes our magnetosphere very weak, which makes us very vulnerable to cosmic rays from the rest of the galaxy as well.
Yeah, exactly. So unless the sun is blasting CMEs at us, our magnetosphere doesn't stay strong. It actually starts to go quiet, so to speak, and it puts us in a very vulnerable position.
Yes.
Now I'm going to throw out the theory here that earthquakes and volcanoes and grand minimas are all related through the sun. Mm-hmm. And I think that what happens is the sun is pouring most of its, that's the closest thing giving us cosmic rays. So during these weak periods, we get a blast of solar cosmic radiation. The solar cosmic radiation causes major earthquakes. Once the crust is cracked from an 8 magnitude, that will allow magma to come up. And then once you have magma coming up in violent volcanoes like Tambora, it gives them an opportunity to explode.
Yeah.
And the first thing we see in the Dalton about 12, this is actually 12, 13, 14, 15 years into the grand minima, the Dalton, we've got the New Madrid.
Yeah.
Now, the New Madrid isn't the only, I'm going to pull this up on the break, isn't the only 8 magnitude happening in 18,
Yes.
10, and 11. There's like 5 of them around the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you look at the historical earthquake data, we'll pull that up after the break. You're going to see this, there's all these 5 and 6 magnitudes for decades. And then right in the Dalton, it's 7.8, 8.2, 7.8. So it's a very bad time to be alive during these grand minimas, which means if cycle 25 stays this week, in the next 5, 10 years, we're going to be seeing more major earthquakes and probably a VEI 6 or 7 eruption.
And they'll blame it on global warming.
Yeah. Well, a headline in Germany that just was yesterday, I think. No one translated it into English except Mark Morano, who's one of the good guys. It's the big headline in Germany is that global warming leads to more snow. It's like, okay. Because like 5 years ago, global warming leads to droughts, right? And then it rained in California. And now it leads to flooding.
Right.
And now it's snow. Because what we've seen 3 years in a row in the Northern Hemisphere is above average snow. The multi-decadal average going back to 1982, we've been above it for 4 years.
Yeah.
So it has to be global warming.
Right. Which is interesting too, because as I recall in the 80s, at least in the Northeast, we had a good amount of snow, pretty significant. So if we're exceeding even that, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, and the nor'easter effect is controlled more by the oceans. So you're talking the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a 60-year cycle, and the AMO. So in 60 years from 1980, it'll be the same in the Northeast.
Right.
So that's coming up. That's in the 2040s.
Another 20 years.
Yeah, the 2040s, which coincides with the end of the empire anyway. The micronova on the sun. What else is happening then? Does the Earth explode during that time as well?
I mean, who the hell knows? Especially with whatever plans the globalists have for us all. Who knows what's happening in 20 years?
Right.
Maybe Bill Gates will have blocked out the sun by then.
It could be happening right now.
And then he'll claim credit for reducing the temperature on Earth, despite the fact that there's a natural process doing it anyway.
Right. The elites will go have to hide in their caves because everything will be frozen.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, people living in the U.S. in 1811 and 1812 were traumatized. Yeah. And this is because of the series of earthquakes, intense intraplate earthquakes. So these are massive quakes happening in the middle of a continental plate. It's very rare. And the way that this happens is the buildup of stress and pressure over thousands of years until it pops for some reason. And I think it's because of this period of increased cosmic rays. I think it does something down there in the asthenosphere or the upper mantle, which triggers the crust to start to slip a little. And this is going to lead on to a different discussion on expanding Earth, because it's kind of connected. It's those cosmic rays and that energy that you and I believe are creating matter at the core, pushing out on the Earth and the mechanism for the expanding Earth hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And so in lesser amounts, it may just crack the plates and you get a boom like the 1812. In fact, all of the earthquakes that are happening, there's been maybe 50,000 earthquakes in New Madrid since this 1811, 1812 series of intraplate earthquakes. Those are all still aftershocks.
I just saw I can't remember what it is now. I have to pull it up later, but somebody was sort of quoting a particular set of aftershocks that were like in like 1855 in Illinois or something like that. So interesting.
And we'll be right back. Don't go away.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons. There are...
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
The Secret Kindergarten is here for the young children of the world. The best program on the radio for kids, dealing with the most important topics in the whole universe. Fairy tales, music and movement, numbers, plants, animals, fun, colors, insects. Take care and cast your ears out to catch a story from the world of other young things. Reach out, up, under, and over. Sing a song. Talk about feelings. Just remember the magic word. The magic word is no. Step on into the Secret Kindergarten. Saturdays, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Revolution Radio.
Interrupt your normally scheduled programming to bring you this important broadcasting announcement.
Now is the time to explore your greatest potential, embracing truth, health, and wellness while discarding the system and exposing its corruption. Experience true freedom every Saturday night between 6 and 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Live from Studio B, it's the Jonathan Wright Show.
Find it right here at revolution.radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Your mic is off.
We're back with the second half of Dalton Minimum Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. Thank God my lovely co-host Leah Shaper made it. I was getting lonely.
I'm sorry. By the way,
Plus I had to keep calling you while I was doing radio.
No, you didn't. I mean, I could have just joined the call at any point, but yeah, that was ridiculous. Are you still hearing an echo on your end?
Nope.
Okay, good.
So let's dive back into it. Oh, what do I got going on here? We were just discussing, we started to discuss the series of New Madrid earthquakes, but I want to bring you over here to the list of historical quakes. And sometime in the beginning of the Dalton Minimum, so here we have some 7 magnitude quakes in the 1760s, just about 1 or 2 a decade. And then right when the Dalton Minimum starts here, which is 1790, some people put it at some people put it at this date, 1796 or 7, because that's when the big ones start. February of 1797, 7.3 in Ecuador, 1797 and 8.4 in Indonesia. That's going to be cracking the crust, preparing Tambora to go boom.
Yeah.
And then the earth keeps shaking. 3 years later, a 7.9 in Romania. 1810, 8 years later, a 7.5 in Crete. But so these are areas where their major civilizations were collapsed due to catastrophes like this. And in Crete, all the people burned up back then when Santorini blew up, which they called Thera, which also might have been exploding in that year, the worst year to be alive.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a direct connection with these low sunspot solar cycle activity and destructive things. And we're making the connection just on earthquakes here.
Yeah.
So we've got the 8.1 in New Madrid. The first one begins right before Christmas of 1811, 9 days before.
Yeah.
And in fact, in just 7 days, it will be the anniversary of that baby. And the first was an 8.1. Which probably changed the direction of the Mississippi. The Mississippi flowed north almost all the way to Iowa. That's how much the crust shifted.
Yeah.
And then January 23rd, so we're talking 1 month later, a 7.8 in the same area. And then guess what happens a month later? Another 8 magnitude in the same area.
Yeah.
So within a period of 3 months, you have 3 8 magnitudes in Missouri.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
It does. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I did find what I was thinking of earlier about the 1855. This was John Reynolds, who was the 4th governor of Illinois. 10 years before he died, in 1855, he wrote about the 1811 quake. And he says that in 1855, people in Illinois were still feeling the aftershocks.
Oh, yeah. But we still have aftershocks today, 1 to 5 a year. Sometimes there's maybe in a month, we'll get 7 at that area. So that area is still relaxing from these 3 8 magnitude earthquakes in 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's insane. Now, if this were to happen today, just a single one of these, the infrastructure and the destruction would literally cease the United States empire.
Yeah.
It would crumble. We would have to split into 2 factions, like 2 different countries, split across the Mississippi, maybe some roads to the north, we would have the northern route, because some highways up in North Dakota would make it across the Mississippi. It would be crazy.
Right.
Not to mention, people don't realize, in New Madrid, over 80% of all the oil and natural gas pipes are going across the Mississippi at that region.
Yeah.
Almost all of them.
Who failed to consult a geologist who knows the history of this region? Like, how incredibly stupid is that?
Well, and it gets worse because when those pipelines crack, they flow into the Mississippi.
Which
we're talking
into the Gulf of
billions of
Mexico.
gallons an hour will dump into there.
Yeah.
And it will toxify the entire Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
And all those people rely on that as a fishery to survive. So if it is a catastrophe scenario, the starvation, the toxicity, it will be a debacle.
It's frankly, it's completely civilization ending, particularly for the United States, which then dominoes into the rest of the globe, right? Because of this incredibly interconnected global economy we have. So this is truly, if this were to go off again now, truly civilization ending, in my opinion. I have a hard time seeing how that wouldn't be the case.
Well, I think that Russia and China, they have their own oil infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of places that could adjust. Right.
And let's point this out. From the day the first earthquake in New Madrid happened, there were 7 and 8 magnitude earthquakes across the world. In December of 1812, and California, there was a quake. Did you see that?
Venezuela, there was a quake.
So the destruction in California from a 7.5 at the high end in Alta, California, it was the San Juan Capistrano earthquake, which collapsed all of the beautiful Spanish missions there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to be localized. 1819 and 8.2 magnitude in India. Mm-hmm. So there will be global effects. South America, it looks like Europe, Asia, it could be anywhere, but it will be everywhere.
By the way, this what I just referenced earlier about John Reynolds talking about the aftershocks in 1855, I just noticed that in this writing, he is actually citing a different earthquake in November of 1811. So that may not have made it on this list because maybe it was not a 7+, but it was a precursor to the December New Madrid quake.
Wow.
Yeah.
So well, this is clearly an incomplete list.
Yes. Well, you know what I would love to do with this list is take all of that data and just plot it, because I bet what you would see are these groups of earthquakes in specific time frames. And surely we don't have a record of all of the large quakes, because surely some of them happened where there were no people living, but it would be really interesting to look at that and then line that up with solar minimums.
I have it.
Oh, well, somebody did the work already.
Sunspot numbers. I got to find it. I shared it with you here. The sun as a significant agent provoking earthquakes. Now, what they did here is they did exactly what you want to do. Here's the paper. The sun as a significant agent provoking earthquakes. And they did an amazing job. So what they do is they plot all of the major booms and they have the KP index at the time.
Nice.
So they're going real deep. They're doing solar cycle and KP index. And it turns out that the large earthquakes either happen at the bottom of the minimum or the peak of the cycle.
Okay.
The reason, but we don't have data on coronal mass ejections that go back this far. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. But what we did see 5 years ago, and I immediately did a podcast when it happened because it blew my mind. We were waiting for an Earth-facing CME to hit Earth, and we were preparing for a G4 geomagnetic storm that goes all the way up to KP8. And it hit. When it hit, the plasma stream hit, we jumped from KP3 to KP7, and an 8.2 earthquake hit Mexico at the same instant.
Yeah.
Everyone said there's no correlation.
No, and I would bet anything that part of the trigger is it's specifically about that shift, that big shift in KP, right? And when we are in grand solar minimum, we're much more susceptible to that. I think we've noticed that in the last couple of years, right? That solar events that don't seem that significant seem to impact our KP more than they used to.
Oh yeah, and we're also seeing all the new types of aurora in the sky, like Steve.
Right. Right. But I think that that would also help explain like why some of these phenomena you're seeing, let's say at the bottom of the minimum, and then some of them you're sort of seeing it at the peak, because we're in a transition of sorts where we're just that much more susceptible to the change. It's like a shock to the system.
Yeah, and that plasma wave from the CME that hit us back then that triggered the 8.2 literally wrung the Earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the crust there was waiting to move. The pressure was built. It just needed to be flicked from the sun.
Yeah.
Which literally it was. It was like getting flicked by,
Yeah. Now, the only thing that would make that that data plotting in this paper even more interesting is if we also had a plot of major volcanoes and to sort of see what the pattern is, because I suspect you're right that it's the earthquakes sort of making the crust weak that make us then susceptible to large earthquakes.
Yeah,
So it'd be
because
interesting to
Tambora
see.
happened at the solar max of the second cycle in the Dalton minimum.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird. It's weird
Yeah.
that they're where these things are going on. But the proof is in the pudding. There is definite correlation between the sun, earthquakes, and large volcanoes.
Yeah, and just to clarify for listeners too, regarding something you just said, the max inside the Dalton minimum, right? Any grand solar minimum is going to go over several solar cycles. So there will still be solar maximums in there. They're just going to be less significant than they normally would be.
Right.
Not normally.
We explained that that's the uniqueness of having the Dalton minimum so close to us and having actual sunspot data.
Yeah.
The conclusion is that grand minimas don't have to be devoid of solar cycles or solar activity.
Right. Well, yeah, like we don't really get to fully see that. Like if you look at the data for the Maunder minimum, because the data is like rather sparse and based on individual observations, you don't get to see that as well.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I found this paper here, and we're going to link you all of these papers below. Solar activity over the last millennium. This is from carbon-14 data, where they showed all of these solar cycles, and they correspond to the known grand minimas, like the Oort minimum. And some of these periods, we have low solar activity for hundreds of years. And we went over that in the beginning. Mm-hmm. A lot of these grand minimas, the smallest ever known is the Dalton, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's 40-year Oort minimum, but a lot of them are 90 years or 100 years or 70 years. So if these are the first 2 week cycles in a grand minima pattern, we could have 3 more even weaker following this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No question.
So
can you explain that paper that you were just showing? What is what would be the correlation between C14 and solar minimums? I'm not clear on that.
Cosmic rays. So
okay. Yeah.
So carbon-14, that's the same way we use tree ring data to extrapolate, which is very bad for extrapolating climate. Yes. Because there are other effects that can have a weak growing year, like no rain.
Right.
And so that's where we got the Michael Mann hockey stick scheme. He took tree ring data and claimed that he claimed whatever he needed to claim on each tree ring to make it colder in the past and warmer now for that hockey stick, which is not the case. But this paper is amazing because it has solar cycles going back 1,000 years.
That's amazing.
In great detail. And what's interesting, at points where the data doesn't match, like in 1280 here, see how it goes out of phase?
Yeah.
This is the collapse of a major collapse of empire worldwide here. So I don't know what happened there, but there weren't any big volcanic eruptions. There was nothing I can find, but except for this.
It's too early. I was going to say 1257 is Mount Somalis.
Yeah, that's back here.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting how they have the data set. We got the data back 1,000 years.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of work to be done here. More people need to dig in on it. But we're living the next grand minima, so we will be experiencing probably all these things that we've just talked about. Unfortunately. There were eyewitness accounts of the New Madrid quake. At supper, we went to sleep as usual. And about 10 o'clock in the night, I was awakened by the most tremendous noise, accompanied by an agitation of the boat so violent that it appeared in danger of upsetting. This guy's in water.
Mm-hmm. He was probably in the best position he could be, actually. I read this account and I was like, that's actually pretty relatively safe.
I could distinctly see the river as if agitated by a storm. And although the noise was inconceivably loud and terrific, I could distinctly hear the crash of falling trees and the screaming of the wildfowl on the river, but found that the boat was still safe at her mooring. By the time we could get to our fire, which was on a large flag in the stern of the boat, the shock had ceased. But immediately, the perpendicular banks, both above and below us, began to fall into the river in such vast masses as nearly to sink our boat by the swell they occasioned. Wow.
Yeah.
At
And
daylight,
yet he was
we had
probably in the
counted
safest position he could
27
have been.
shots. What'd you say?
Yeah. And yet he's probably in one of the safest places he could be.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been completely terrifying. I mean, just even reading the accounts of how the animals respond, I mean, not surprisingly, but just sheer terror. You don't know what the heck is going on, and you've never experienced anything like this in your life.
The New Madrid seismic zone. So those that are living there, you better buckle up, Buttercup. You might be getting some activity because in a report filed in November 2008, the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, our favorite, FEMA, warned that a serious earthquake in the New Madrid seismic zone would result in the highest economic losses due to natural disaster in the United States. Further predicting widespread and catastrophic damage across Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Missouri, in particular, Tennessee. That is insane. The amount of people living in this region is in the tens of millions.
They only give it a 7 to 10% chance in the next 50 years of happening again. I wonder how accurate that is.
I wouldn't be buying any property with that kind of odds, would you?
I mean, if the 7 to 10% is correct, me personally, no, but I could sort of reasonably accept someone else doing that. It's not a high percentage. I don't know if I believe that percentage, though, right? Because if you start squawking about this being a stronger likelihood, then you're going to disrupt a lot of economic activity that's quite vital. And it's not like you can just pick up like gas pipelines and move them easily, right? So, yeah. And most of the homes in this area aren't built to withstand earthquakes. It's not like we're in Chile. No. Well, that's another interesting thing. When you read the accounts of New Madrid, one of the things that's pointed out is first of all, there weren't a whole lot of people living in this area at the time. This was like the western edge of American colonialism, whatever you want to call it. But secondly, a lot of the structures were built with wood, so they were less prone to falling apart.
Yeah,
you might have your chimney might fall. What?
They creaked and quaked, but they didn't fall down because they weren't made of bricks.
Right.
It's the brick structures that crush and kill you, typically not the wood ones.
Right.
Because
well, and that's exactly why you get all of these structures where the chimneys fall, but the rest of the structure is fine.
Yeah, and if a wood house falls, you still have the peak of the roof that's still there and it may not crush you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's less likely to crush you.
Yeah.
Wood is lighter than bricks, too.
Yeah, that helps.
So on the night of 16 November 1811, an earthquake occurred that produced great consternation among the people. That's funny. The whole valley of the Mississippi was violently agitated. Our family were sleeping in a log cabin, and my father leaped out of bed crying aloud, "The Indians are on the house!" We laughed at the mistake of my father, but soon found out it was worse than the Indians. Not one in the what?
By a lot.
Yeah, not one in the family knew at the time that it was an earthquake. The next morning, another shock made us acquainted with it. So we decided it was an earthquake. It took a second earthquake for them to realize it was an earthquake.
Yeah.
The cattle came running home, bellowing with fear, and all animals were terribly alarmed on the occasion. Our house cracked and quivered, so we were fearful it would fall to the ground. In the American bottom, many chimneys were thrown down, and the church bell in Cahokia sounded by the agitation of the building. Cahokia. So we are colonizing where the mound builders once had major cities. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting.
I didn't catch that connection till just then.
Yeah.
Now, the bad news is that The underlying cause of the earthquake in New Madrid is not well understood, nor is the New Madrid seismic zone.
No.
It just shows you how much we know about stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I was,
Go
go ahead. I was trying to imagine earlier being in this setting when this earthquake goes off. And granted, I don't have a lot of experience with earthquakes, just little tiny ones.
Yeah.
But I was reminded of like almost 20 years ago, my ex-husband and I were living in this apartment, and halfway down the block at 3 a.m, we were awakened because a trolley came off the tracks and crashed into the building on the corner. And I can't even explain how startling that was to wake up like that, and the vibration, and I could hear water rushing. And I initially thought it was a giant earthquake, and I'm thinking, like, what are the odds? And so this event has to be like 100 times more severe in terms of vibration and noise and shaking than what it's very hard to even imagine experiencing this. It must have been so incredibly terrifying.
Well, and after the second one and the third one, what you think it's never going to end.
Right. And then it keeps coming. And then you're like, dear God, save us, you know? Like, what did we do wrong? Are we being punished? You know?
Yeah, it's the main talking point of, even if they had something set up in this area to protect the infrastructure, let's say they had a crack team after an 8 magnitude to come out and cap all of the cracked pipes and stuff like that. What if it happens again a month later after they've done it all? And then again, this is a very bad scenario. And this isn't the only place on Earth that these things can happen. We've got a little microcosm here of the Midwest we're discussing.
Yes. I mean,
the problem is, and the difference is that there are tens of millions of people here instead of tens of people.
Yes. It would be also really interesting to hear accounts from, let's say, maybe people on the East Coast, right? Because this part of the world, the vibrations from earthquake tend to travel a lot further, correct?
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to find some of those accounts of like whatever rumbling might have been felt in, Virginia or Pennsylvania or something.
Yeah, well, they have maps that can picture, like, if an 8 magnitude happens here, what it would feel like as you go out.
Yeah.
So like in Philly, it might feel like a 4 magnitude.
Right.
That's still 2,000 miles away.
Right. Well, and we've experienced that. I mean, I remember there was a quake. I don't remember what magnitude it was, and I want to say it was in Vermont, but I really don't remember. But we felt it all the way in Pennsylvania.
14 years ago, there was a quake in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and that's the one we felt in Philly.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking of. I just remember I was sitting at my desk.
It was like a 4.8, I think. We can go look.
Yeah, I was sitting at my desk, and I'm suddenly looking, my lamp is vibrating like this, and I'm like, what's going on?
I was on the street downtown in Center City, more like in a residential neighborhood in South Philly.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people running out of their house, telling people to get inside. There's an earthquake.
Oh, no.
Like, no, you do the opposite.
No.
Yeah. Proper prior preparation prevents piss poor performance when you're telling people to run inside their stone structures in Philadelphia. 3-story stone structures built 100 years ago.
It's kind of as asinine as like teaching children to like hide under their desks in the event of bombs. Like that always seemed incredibly stupid to me too. Like a desk is going to save you.
It's just going to save you from the plaster on the roof that's cracking you in the head and killing you. So that's what it's for.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But if the ceiling collapses, I don't think I don't think the desk is going to help you that much.
Or a kitchen table. But in most large earthquakes, what you have to worry about is falling glass and ceiling parts. So stop, drop, and roll is good for fire, and tuck and duck is good for earthquakes.
Sure.
Because you don't want to hit your noggin.
But go outside, ideally.
Or just go outside and lie down. That's what you should do.
Yeah.
Now, the people in this region are not foreigners to seismic activity. There have been over 4,000 earthquakes in the New Madrid seismic zone since 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And probably more like 12,000 because they only are counting 1 magnitude or greater.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of lessers happening here. And if you look at this map, these are all aftershocks they're claiming from an earthquake that happened right here That black dot north of Memphis.
Yeah.
Prepare for the big one, folks. It's coming.
Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
Be safe. We love you.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.